Thank you all for coming and welcome to this panel called ESG, A Global Vision. First of all, I would like to thank the World Jurist Association and the World Law Foundation for continuing pursuing its purpose. I would also like to thank the New York Bar Association for hosting this Congress, and I also would like to thank as well the compromise and commitment of all the sponsors that make this Congress possible. My name is Víctor Martínez-Simancas. I'm a senior counsel at Iberdrola, and we have here today with us, on my right, Teresa, senior associate at the Litigation and Arbitration Department of Garrigues, Jennifer Riveiro Ilende, founder and managing partner of Ilende and Partners, Maia, partner and head of the U.S. Public Company Advisory Group at White & Case, and here on my left, Jose-Felix Zaldivar, managing partner of Uria's Menendez New York office. Here today with this amazing panelist, we'll be speaking about sustainability and ESG. The main goal of this panel is to discover whether the planet is developing towards a more sustainable future and how different regions are progressing in these terms, their current situation, key aspects, and main challenges they might be facing. Before moving forward, for those who are unfamiliar with sustainability and the term ESG, although our panelists will later get into further details, I would like to quickly address this concept. We're all here related to the corporate world, so I will address the ESG and sustainability concepts through a corporate perspective, where sustainability in the corporate world has become a main concern in these recent years. When we want to see whether a company is sustainable or not, meaning whether a company would increase or at least maintain its value in the long term, we first have to analyze whether its business is a profitable one, and then, once we confirm the business is a profitable one, we have to analyze whether the company is sustainable or not. Now, how can we measure or analyze a company's sustainability? Well, the variety of factors is very broad, and that's when the ESG term comes in, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. We have to assess the company's policies, regulations, and actions through three main metrics or criteria: the environmental section, climate change, biodiversity; the social section, relationship with employees, suppliers, customers, and we also have, lastly, the corporate governance section, shareholders and other stakeholders' rights, company's leadership, internal controls. As a result, we would have more information to predict how sustainable the company is, or, in other words, how likely is for the company to sustain its value in the long term. Nonetheless, the United Nations has been, in the last decades, encouraging companies to act more responsible, take conscious business decisions, and commit to contribute to the sustainable development of the planet. A key breaking point was in 2015, when the UN member states adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. Since then, institutional investors, proxy advisors, and stakeholders are demanding companies to integrate these SDGs in their business activities and commit with the society. Since then, ESG has moved from a concern of minimum compliance to a commitment of maximum innovation and development in terms of sustainability. Now, to achieve the 2030 and 2050 agendas and to achieve a more sustainable planet in the end, it's not enough to rest on companies' commitments. We need the society to be committed as a whole. We need the people to be conscious on how transcendent reaching these goals is, as well as administrations, institutions, governments, regulations, etc. If we only have companies committed, but the society and governments are not, it would be very unlikely to reach the 2030 and the 2050 agendas. Thus, we would like to share with you today how the different communities and different regulators are progressing in terms of sustainability within the planet. Before moving on, for example, Europe which is known to be a leader in terms of sustainability. Very briefly to say how Europe is developing there and how the progress of Europe is being possible. Again, we have to assess the three main criteria. We can say that Europe is good, has a good G, a good corporate governance, or a good governance, as it's not a corporation, but the analysis compares to it. So Europe has a good governance, as most countries have democracy, separation of powers, and obviously a respect for the rule of law. We can also say that Europe has a good S, good social standards to these rights and respect for the rights and respect for individuals within the communities go farther than the compliance with human rights. And lastly, Europe is leading the E section, the environmental section, with notable regulation to meet efficiently, as soon as possible, the 2030 and 2050 agendas. Having said that, however, in these recent years, we have had two specific situations, two specific changes that have affected the sustainable development of Europe. The first one, of course, is COVID. At that time, many rights were restricted to the population due to a need to protect public health. And that stop or cease the development, the sustainable development of Europe. And then later on, we had the war in Ukraine, where in addition to the apparent consequences of a war, Europe suffered many other consequences. And in particular, I would like to highlight energy consequences. At this point, Europe had to prioritize granting energy supply to the population over taking more steps towards the clean energy transition strategy. So here we see how certain circumstances of a specific region or a specific country may affect or change the speed and the priorities in sustainable development. So let's move on and see how different regions of the planet are progressing in terms of sustainability and how their particular circumstances condition their sustainable strategy. So Teresa, would you please share with us the key aspects of sustainable development in Asia, please?
Yes, thank you, Victor. It's an honor to be here. Please first allow me to start with a little story. 10 years ago, in 2013, an 8-story manufacturing building called Rana Plaza in Bangladesh collapsed, and over 1,000 workers lost their lives and many others were injured. This tragedy brought to light a series of supply chain management issues for many global garment manufacturers and shocked up consumers. For investors, it highlighted in that moment the importance of ESG practices as a key factor for driving investor behavior. The Rana Plaza disaster in that moment led to a movement for a change. People demanded that fashion companies be accountable and transparent. Governments and organizations had to address these problems and make sure that tragedies like this never happen again. Companies too have taken steps to address these problems, and many fashion brands and manufacturers have implemented since then codes of conduct and improved working conditions and labor rights for the supply chain. The Rana Plaza disaster and tragedy serves as a stark reminder that ESG implementation requires a continuous effort from both government and companies. So I'm here to talk about the ESG regarding Asia. My name is Teresa. I'm a lawyer, senior associate at the Litigation Department of Garrigues in Madrid. I'm second generation of a Chinese family that emigrated to Spain from Zhejiang, a province close to Shanghai that is in the center-south of China. Given the vast scope of ESG and the limited amount of time we have, I will be focusing on specific ESG issues within the Asian context, and I will try to shine a spotlight on some ESG initiatives and regulations in China and the purposes and challenges and future prospects in this area. I hope to can give you some valuable insights to the specific issues that are shaping Asia's agenda. So let's get started with first the ESG context in Asia. In recent years, there's been a global trend and growing attention towards ESG in Asia. Companies, governments, investors are recognizing the importance of these practices into their operations and decision-making process. I do believe that Asia represents the biggest opportunity for ESG action. The region is home for almost 60% of the world's population, accounts for 53% of primary energy consumption, and generates 45% of the global gross domestic product. In the region, Japan and Singapore have emerged as market leaders of the disclosure of ESG metrics. Among those that disclose, 65% of the companies in Singapore incorporate one of the ESG metrics in their reports, followed by Japan at 62%. In this regard, Hong Kong is emerging as a key hub for sustainable and green investment in China. Since the mandatory of ESG disclosure by listed companies in 2015, Hong Kong Stock Exchange required that its company reports ESG metrics and continue to enhance its commitment and disclosure requirements. Hong Kong plans to tighten up climate-related issues and disclosure rules, mandating all listed companies to report climate metrics in accordance with the International Sustainability Standard Boards from January 2024. Hong Kong is right now uniquely positioned as a sustainable finance hub and a gateway for green investments in mainland China. I think that these examples highlight some of the regions and countries that have demonstrated strong ESG performance in Asia. But there are a lot of challenges and significant environmental and social problems right now in the region. For example, pollution is a pressing concern, with air and water pollution levels often surpassing acceptable limits. According to the World Health Organization, almost the entire global population is right now exposed to unsafe pollution. And according to the United Nations Environmental Program, 70% of air pollution or related deaths occur in Asia Pacific. Climate change is another issue that poses a grave threat to Asia right now, with rising temperatures, changing rainfall patterns, and extreme weather conditions. The Asia Development Bank estimates that the region incurs economic losses of around its 2% GDP annually due to climate changes incidents. Social inequality is another persistent challenge for the region, with significant wealth gap and disparities in access to basic services such as healthcare or education. The United Nations Development Program reports that Asia is home to the largest number of people living in extreme poverty, while income gap and continues to increase and widen in several countries. I think that this statistic underscores the urgent need for a comprehensive action by governments and regulators. There's a need to address pollution, mitigate climate change, and promote social inclusivity. Only by that, Asia can unlock its immense potential for a more sustainable and brighter future. ESG in China, in concrete, I think it's growing also in the country, because China has the ambition to green its economy and improve social inclusivity. After all, China has the ambition to reach peak carbon by 2030 and be carbon neutral by 2060. So that requires companies to transition to a low carbon model business. And ESG disclosure in China has increased over the past decade for this reason. According to JP Morgan, nearly 90% of the companies listed in the Shanghai, Shenzhen stock exchanges produced voluntary ESG reports in 2025, up from just 49% from 2010. However, China has a lot of problems because they don't have unified ESG information disclosure standard for domestic listed companies. They have not yet issued ESG legal documents, only some relevant rules or regulations related to environmental or some social responsibility. Additionally, there's another problem is that overseas investors that they don't have local language resources may struggle to get the full picture because companies that are only listed in onshore market, they tend to report only in Chinese. So it's difficult sometimes to get the correct data and the full information. But I think that despite these challenges, Chinese companies are approaching somewhat a leapfrog moment in ESG measurement and reporting. With a stronger push from investors, regulators, and government, it can be expected that more Chinese companies will disclose more and better ESG data over time. In conclusion, I think that as we navigate the path towards a more sustainable future in Asia and in the world, it is good to remember the wisdom of a Chinese proverb, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step. I believe that incorporating ESG into business strategy is this crucial first step. By integrating environmental and social responsibility with a strong governance practice, business can drive positive impact, foster innovation, and create value for all stakeholders. For international investors, it's even more crucial that they recognize the importance of ESG in the region, in Asia, because it is through their investments and partnerships that they can create more and contribute to a more sustainable development and support local communities. And as we embark in this journey, each decision, each action holds the power to make the difference. So ESG integration in Asia has the potential to drive positive impact and changes. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with this very first step. That's my conclusion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Teresa. It's been wonderful to hear how Asia is committed to sustainable development and the progresses that Asia is taking towards reaching a more sustainable planet in the future. And I would like to hear about Africa. So, well, all of us would like to hear, not only me, about Africa. So, Jennifer, if you'd be so kind to address how is sustainability going forward in Africa.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for having me here today. And first of all, it's important to address, before starting discussing any other matter, how access to energy is so taken for granted in the rest of the world, but in Africa, half of the population don't have access to any sort of electricity. Therefore, all inequalities are born from there. We talk about countries such as Nigeria, Angola, Algeria, or Equatorial Guinea, where I'm from, are top of the echelon oil and gas producers in the world. However, these fossil fuels have contributed to the development of all the rest of the infrastructures, and yet all the continent combined only pollute or is only responsible for 2% of global CO2 emissions. Therefore, when we talk about an energy transition that could lead to the rest of social and governance development, we need to talk first of what are the alternatives, both for their resources and the financing of any other project. For African countries, it's important to secure the financing before securing anything else when it comes to the energy sources. We talk about 1.4 billion people that are compromised by any change, and yet we are pushed to cleaner energies when we yet have not, when we yet are in the very early stages of our development. But, however, as I said, yet most of our countries are involved in fossil fuel development, production, and trading, all the countries are looking forward cleaner alternatives and do this big switch. Countries like my own, as I said, I'm from Equatorial Guinea. It's the third oil-producing country in the continent. Has yet of today is yet applying the Spanish 19th century civil and criminal code. However, they had made a priority the environmental, passing a law in 2003 to protect and promote the preservation of nature when it comes into the companies that would engage in the oil production. As well, they have passed important laws in 2013 following Nigerian leading in these terms, that is local content laws that promote that companies that are engaged in the oil and gas production industry engage the local communities both in the training, healthcare, education programs to support the governments in the development of that aspect. However, as I said, all effective governance within our country, within our continent, require effective financing. So, therefore, for African nations, it's very, very important to secure how we are going to finance any transition to a sustainable model.
Thank you very much. Actually, Jennifer, I'm very concerned, and that's a question I always ask myself, whether in terms of sustainability, and speaking about ESG, if there is any priority there, if you can maybe not start or continue with progress in the environmental section, if you don't have good social standards, for example, if you don't have your population with great access to social security, healthcare, education, and maybe if you don't have a good governance, meaning good democracy, good separation of powers, how can you move later to the S or to the E of
Exactly.
ESG? So the question is, do you see that some countries are prioritizing a section over another in their sustainable strategy?
As I said, even though most of these countries, as I mentioned, are engaged or involved in fossil fuel-based economies, yet the overall of the continent is not so engaged in the greenhouse gas emission, in the greenhouse emissions. Therefore, the priority for the continent, as I said, is electrification, because if there is no access to electricity, you can die at any moment in an operation room. You cannot engage into no form of education if, as I said, half of the continent has no access to power. So for the overall of the countries within the continent, electrification is the first priority, because how an average African would care about how its governance is, what kind of governance models they have if they have no power, if they can die at any moment just due to electricity shortage. As I said, in the Western world, electricity is so taken for granted, but over there, it's not the norm. Myself, I was there last week having electricity shortage in a country that is gas-based, and we have also a lot of electricity sources alternatives, and we are looking forward more sources of clean energy, and they're pushing a lot. Is yet, as I said, is yet not granted. So for the continent to look after any form of social development, any sort of stronger governance, we need to go firstly to the main source of all the problems, which are lack of access to electricity, and that is the main focus and the global focus within all the countries.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Sorry that we're sharing the microphone. Thank you very much. It's been very illustrative and insightful, and it's great to see how well within you all know Europe, Asia, and Africa, energy is a priority. So let's move over the Atlantic to North America. Maia, please, if you can let us know how sustainability is moving forward in key aspects in North America.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. I mean, I really appreciate your last words. It just shows how, when we talk about ESG in one clear vision or another, but then the nuance around the world, we talk about energy transition and trying to decrease the amount of emissions, and then in a place where, we need to actually to foster development. So it's really fascinating. In the United States, ESG is really at a crossroads. I'd say over the last 5 to 8 years, there was a clear path towards, where we were going with ESG. And that included increasing disclosure, sustainability reporting, increasing companies announcing all sorts of goals and targets on decreasing their emissions. And we've reached a crossroads. ESG has become a very politicized word. And now very much so, sustainability is considered the word that is used more than you will see the large institutional investors and the large corporations having a recalibration moment, a pause, and a move away from using the term ESG. Now, this doesn't mean that all the aspects of ESG that we've always been talking about are going away. It's just because of the politicization of it. So I'll also start with a little bit of a story. I'm on the board of the Society for Corporate Governance, which represents more U.S. public companies than any other organization in their corporate governance. And this includes the securities filings that are filed with the SEC, and also the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ rules. And a lot of the fundamental aspects of this started with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in 2002, where there was a requirement for all public companies to adopt a code of ethics following the Enron scandal. So no one really knew about the term ESG at the time, but we had, the fundamentals, independent directors, and so forth. So that started those are really the fundamentals of this organization. In any event, on the first day of the largest conference of the year, there are committee discussions, and one of the committees, called the Corporate Practices Committee, which has the largest number of Fortune 100 companies attending that meeting, there was one chief sustainability officer who got up and gave a speech on what, for her company, ESG meant. And why it was important to embrace it. And the crux of that was really aligning shareholder value with the ESG priorities that the company was pursuing. So it was the question of value versus values, right? So there over the last 5 years, there has been an increasing amount of pressure on companies to take actions, from shareholder activists to adopt measures or report on items that might not be related to the business, or might not be beneficial, or might not be aligned with actually producing financial value to the shareholders, right? And in the United States, most companies are not public benefit corporations. In contrast, they're incorporated corporations, mostly in Delaware, and their fiduciary duties owed to the shareholders, and that's to go to work in the interests of shareholders and to provide financial value. And the crux of the speech was that where there is overlap between shareholder value and the values, those are things that can be pursued. When there is misalignment, so you pursue something that is not in alignment with, shareholder value, if anything, it might hurt or damage shareholder value, then it's something not to pursue, right? Even if it's in the name of whatever political agenda you call it. So that importance of alignment and that importance of defining ESG for a company as, those risks and opportunities that align with, long-term shareholder value. And that speech received a resounding applause at this meeting. from a group of companies that are receiving increasing pressure to take steps that might not always be related to what they need to pursue. For example, trying to minimize, what are the, and try to calculate and report on what might be impacts of their products all over, the world, and trying to, calculate that, even if it's, they produce a widget that ends up, 5 companies down, it's sold to one company, then it's sold to another, and then it's destroyed and then turned into something else, and it's called, scope, we have the idea of the value chain, right? How are we going to calculate that versus things that are in our control, in our company's control, we can actually calculate and identify that. So that's, a fundamental struggle, I would say, is, what is each company responsible for, the shareholders or all of the stakeholders. So that's, one of the tensions. The other real crux of the battle in the United States and the philosophical difference is, what is material, right? Is it material to all of your stakeholders, or is it only material to your investors, right? And the idea that in the end of the day, governments now should be responsible for the broader, world challenges, as opposed to companies that have to, be concerned about shareholder value as well, because if they just, let's just say if they start, we all would want to solve the problem of homelessness, let's say, but if we decide to build a mansion for every single homeless person and not use the money towards, investing in our business, that might not be beneficial for shareholders, even though it would be beneficial for providing homes to those people. So it's that struggle of identifying what aspects of ESG are important for our company. So let's go back to the political battle. We have on the state level, we have state anti-ESG laws that are expanding in scope and reach, and that's the most dramatic development, mostly on the state level, and that's mostly related to retirement funds, right? Where are we going to use those retirement funds? So there's 7 states that have enacted laws that seek to prohibit or discourage public entities from considering ESG when they invest in companies. So in other words, you can only consider, if you're investing, let's say, the retirement funds of state employees, you can only consider what is going to be financially profitable for that investment, those funds, as opposed to also considering all the, community, societal, other factors, right? So those states, those are mostly Republican states. It's a political thing here, right? So those are Republican states adopting those laws. Also, there are another 8 states that are adopting laws that are seeking to prohibit business with doing, if a company is boycotting, let's say, oil and gas companies, right? And then they will, it is a law that is targeting companies that are doing business with states on the basis of boycotts or discrimination with industry. So basically saying, hey, listen, if you're not doing business with oil companies, then we're not going to support you because you're boycotting a certain industry, right? And as we said, there's nuance here because an oil company could providing oil to let's say an African country that needs the oil, right? So then that company is being boycotted by certain ESG laws, and then the state is adopting laws to kind of ban that trend. So those are the 2 types of laws. We also have a federal versus state battle, right? So on the federal level, we have the Department of Labor that released a final rule that had allowed fiduciaries to consider ESG factors, meaning non-financial factors, when they're considering where to invest retirement funds of employees. And there was the state law backlash against that. There's state laws that say no, we're not going to allow the investments in ESG focused only for financial incentives, right? So that that struggle on the investor level is has been very real on the state level. At the same time, also on the federal level, we've seen the Inflation Reduction Act that directs new federal spending towards reducing carbon emissions, and that has been, revolutionized many aspects of ESG. And so you have, certain Republican states that are now home to more investment on energy transition than as a result of all of those benefits. And then you also have the tension, right, at the Supreme Court level, right? So you have a Democratic president, and then you have a Supreme Court that is, Republican. And so we just, as many of you know, we just had the decision on the affirmative action that there was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, which bars, racial discrimination. So that you can't discriminate, and because of that, no more affirmative action at Harvard and University of North Carolina. And there was that decision. And so now, companies are reevaluating and reassessing their, having to, take a pause and think about, what do we do with our own D&I policies? So, meaning diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. So there's this tension right now between, we had kind of this train, role of, ESG agendas and priorities, and then this kind of political pushback right now. And on the, at the SEC level, so I deal with the Securities and Exchange as a securities lawyer at the Securities and Exchange Commission a lot. We've had a delay because of one of the Supreme Court decisions, which was against certain environmental laws, saying, the federal government didn't have the authority to enact certain, environmental laws. And as a result of that, the SEC has paused on its adoption of SEC climate rules. They were proposed in March 2022, and now we expect them in October 2023, but we might see a more watered down version of that. In the proposed rules, it was a very extensive rule that not only related to board risks, oversight, GHG emissions, scope 1 and 2, which many companies are already reporting on, but also scope 3, and then also financial statement disclosure at a 1%, anything impacting 1% or more would need to be disclosed on a separate line item of your financial statements. And so companies were expressing many companies were expressing dismay at this rule because it was not pursuant to any legislation. It was pursuant to, just federal agency action without, legislation. So we have that on the federal front. And then I think the last layer I'll add to all of this before I'll pause and turn it over to questions, because I do better on questions because there's a lot going on, is the shareholder proposal. So we have in the United States, we have a rule called 14A8 that permits any investor that holds a minimal number of shares to submit a proposal, an ESG proposal. These really have become an ESG proposal rule to get into the proxy statement of companies when they send out their proxy statements to elect board members every year. And these are very much have become ideological shareholder proposals. It's also a good gauge to know how ESG is doing. This year, the proposals went up. The number of proposals went down, but the support for them went down. So we had a decrease in support. In this year, ExxonMobil and Chevron, the shareholders rejected calls for stronger measures to mitigate climate change. This is the same ExxonMobil where a couple of years ago we had an activist succeed to get a climate activist, engine number 1, succeed to get 2 board seats. So really the tables have turned on the proposals, on these 14A8 proposals. And one of the reasons for that is also the institutional investors. We're sitting in New York City, and we have a lot of the institutional investors that are headquartered here. We have BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and we can see them moving away from the ESG nomenclature. We can see them now using sustainability we can see them now more interested in that shareholder value, as I started to talk about at the beginning of the conversation, saying that it's up to the government to make policy and to enact legislation, and not for companies and asset managers to figure this out. Obviously, the climate issues that we have in the world are larger than any one company to, from these institutional investors to be able to solve. So, I think that's kind of a quick overview of all the little elements that we have. We have, state laws battling against federal. We do have a lot of, we do expect the climate rules to come out. And I think the only last point I will make is, we do have the European, I think, you'll speak to, but we have, certain European laws such as CSRD, which is called, and so for U.S. companies that have European operations, they're going to be subject to that. So for disclosure purposes. So, there is movement, together, but I think there's a question on, what is really aligned with shareholder value.
Right. Thank you very much, Maia. Let me say first that I'm shocked with what you've said about all the politicization of ESG. I want to ask you something, but please, if any of you want to ask something to each other, feel free to do so. And I'm shocked because I'm totally against politicizing a need of the planet and of the society. And I started my introducing speech saying that once the UN committed to the 2030 agenda and the 2050 agenda, that became not only a commitment that we need from the companies, but it's, as I said, a commitment that we need and a compromise that we need from the society as a whole. So we've been hearing how, well, very briefly, but how Europe is moving forward in sustainable development, how Asia is committed to that, how Africa is committed as well and has a very important need. And then we come to the U.S. that we expect to be, a very developed country and moving forward towards sustainable development. And we see how we have this ESG or sustainability politicized.
I think one thing to keep in mind is, and as I mentioned, we have, here in the U.S. we have things that, all public companies have to have a code of ethics, right? So there are already, I would say, standards of, at least on the, S and the G side, that are, I would say, fundamental to any company, right? And the idea that I think each company, when they say, oh, we're recalibrating our ESG, it's the idea that, okay, this is bigger than just me, right? When we talk about this global problem, this is something that, when I say it's a crossroads because I think every company is saying, okay, we can't do this on our own, right? Because we're in the middle of if there's an economic slowdown and we're firing employees because we don't have enough profits, right? Then how are we really going to solve the planet problems if we're in bankruptcy or if we're having to fire employees, right? We are, in the end of the day, a company that needs to, be profitable, right? Right. So how are we going to I think the point of all of this politicization is that it's a much bigger problem than any one company, and each company needs to consider, and there needs to be consideration on what each company can do. But I think the imposition of saying, okay, this is what you must do, it's a question of, what is actually, valuable for that company.
Right, so commit to sustainability, but have the freedom to make your way and transition in the way you better, like not impose sustainability with too much regulation, more or less. That's how we can be seen from these states that you were mentioning.
Yeah, I think it's more of like, how does it align with that particular company's business, right? Right. So how can that company, align with it, and considering, what can be done that's still going to, some companies might need to transform their businesses, but some companies, for example, if they're providing, I'm just throwing this out there, but if they're providing, oil to an African country, should that be company penalized and not receive investment because they're, producing emissions in a place in the world, exactly. Right? So there's nuance here that I think has been introduced in the United States, maybe in a way, from my view, but because of sort of the advanced nature of the investor demands on companies, there's a pause saying, well, of course, if you can't have a dam collapse and have all these employees killed, well, of course, the shareholder value is going to go down tremendously at that kind of, I mean, like, for example, Vale and, Brazil, right? That's going to impact the company. They're going to be subject to enforcement actions and all of that. So those are extreme givens, but a company reporting on, and fixing its value chain, is that what they're responsible for, or is that the government, right?
Yeah, no, and in the end, I'm always more for incentivizing and against penalizing, so that could make sense as well. So thank you very much, Maia. I think we're ready to move towards Latin America. Jose-Felix.
Sure.
Please.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure being with you. Let me start, after what we've heard in Asia, Africa, and the US, and briefly Europe. I would say that Latin America is sort of in the middle of the progression. And I think it's safe to say that we're experiencing a transformative movement in the region that will result in the full integration of ESG, environmental, social, and governance principles into the core of the business landscape in Latin America. Latin American companies are embracing more and more an ESG-driven approach, as is evidenced by the IDB Corporate Sustainability Index that tracks the 100 companies in Latin America and the Caribbean that are more sustainable or disclosing more sustainable elements. The index has been published between 2017.